Welcome back, everyone. So, today we're going to pick up again and carry on with our discussion and focus on different types of governments and their responses to terrorism. And today we're really going to be focusing on authoritarian governments and terrorism. Look at some of the various components of how they deal with it. What are their options? How do they differ from other types of governments and how they respond to terrorism? So, let's jump right in. What do we need to do? First, we need to get a definition out there of what an authoritarian government is. This is a term we use a lot, but really try to provide a clear definition to help us think about them in contrast to democracies as we progress through our lecture today. So, what is an authoritarian government? We can think of an authoritarian government as a form of government with limited political freedoms and minimal checks on governmental power. And so there's a lot of components that we can think about if we build this definition out more, look more deeply into it. So we just think about limited political freedoms. We think authoritarian governments have restrictions on freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, all these things that perhaps we don't think about too often in democracy. Authoritarian governments do not allow their citizens to have these same particular rights that we have in democracy. So these are important things to think about. And then we also think about the idea that authoritarian governments really have minimal checks on governmental powers. And then we can think about this in terms of, authoritarian governments' capacity to infringe upon and control people's lives, limit their political freedoms. But we can also think about it based on the fact that we don't see this normal style of checks and balances that we see in a democracy, where in the United States, for example, we divide up power among the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch. In authoritarian governments, power is concentrated in the hands of a small group of individuals, sometimes one individual, who have the capacity to make all the decisions for a country. And so there are really no checks on their capacity to make decisions without either consulting the people or even other people in power, right? They have really ability to do what they want when they want. And so in a good example to think about a stereotypical example of what an authoritarian government is would be a monarchy. Now, there aren't many monarchies left in the world, but just one example here is the King of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, meaning that power is passed from father to son in this case. So the way that leadership is determined is simply based on a royal family. This is how power is passed. It's not power is not delegated to leaders by the people. There are no checks on these individuals. Simply, if you're born into this position, you're in a position to rule. So let's look at authoritarian governments and how they relate to terrorism. So first, let's think about why do terrorist groups emerge and persist in authoritarian governments. And so we can see in some ways they have perhaps some similar reasons that we see in democracies, actually. But maybe we need to take it to a more extreme way of thinking. So first, we look at this idea of lack of representation, right? As I was just discussing, authoritarian governments really don't give people any real say in terms of who their political leaders are, what policies are passed by leaders. So there's really a lack of representation of the people and the people's interests in governmental decision making. So a few people in positions of power make decisions without really considering what the people want. So this is and this often leads to this idea of unaddressed grievances. So there are lots of things that the citizens may want that the government has no interest in responding to in terms of providing certain public goods that they want, like healthcare, other things like this. And this leads oftentimes citizens to be willing to resort to violence be willing to engage in terrorist actions against other governments. And oftentimes, not only is there a lack of representation, there's unaddressed grievances, but these authoritarian governments are very willing to engage in extreme repression of their population. They're willing to kill, disappear, put in prison anybody who disagrees with their particular policy objectives. So one example of this we could see in Russia. Russia controls a region in what's considered the Caucasus Mountains, an area called Chechnya, near Georgia, Turkey, Armenia. And Russia has controlled Chechnya since the 1700s. And Chechnya has long wanted independence from Russia. And Russia has been willing to engage in extreme repressive tactics to try and prevent them from seceding, becoming their own independent state. And so they've engaged in extreme tactics, which has led to the rise of Chechen terrorists. This individual here, you see in the picture, his name is Doka Umarov, who was the leader of a Chechen terrorist organization, Islamically motivated terrorist organization. Chechnya is predominantly Muslim, whereas a good percentage of Russia is Christian. So there's also this cultural differences between the groups, but Russia's been willing to engage in extreme repression of the Chechen population. And so individuals like Doka Umarov have seen terrorism as their main strategy for trying to overthrow the Russian government, or at least pressure the Russian government into giving them their independence. Chechnya still remains part of Russia, so they haven't truly succeeded, but these groups are willing to take up extreme action in the face of extreme repression. So how do authoritarian governments combat terrorism? Well, they're able to do so in different ways than democracies. So they often have to give human rights even less consideration than democracies. Democracies, as we talked about last class, have been willing at times to violate civil liberties, civil rights, human rights, but for the most part, they're much better at respecting human rights than authoritarian governments. Authoritarian governments are already focused on maintaining power with a small group of people, and this means they're willing to take extreme measures to try and repress individuals. And oftentimes they don't even try to hide their tactics. And we can think about their willingness to not try to hide their tactics because, like we said, terrorists use their attacks as a communication strategy, right? They want to send a message. Well, authoritarian governments like the Egyptian government, this here is the president of Egypt named Al-Sisi. Al-Sisi is the president of the Egyptian government, has been willing to engage in brutal tactics to combat what he sees as individuals and groups who are trying to overthrow his regime. Groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. He's been willing to disappear their leaders, murder them, put them in prisons, torture them. And he oftentimes doesn't even really try to hide his actions because he wants to send a particularly strong message. So while terrorists may be willing to engage in big spectacles of action to try to scare the government, authoritarian governments are often willing to use extreme tactics as a communication strategy as well. And we often see that authoritarian governments, because they are based on the idea of a small group of people controlling power, maintaining control of the government, they're even less willing to compromise than democracies. And so this means they're even perhaps less willing to compromise with these terrorist groups who are taking up action against them and are willing to thus continue to act repressively, not compromise with these groups. So, discussion question 1. Want to ask, are terrorist tactics justified against authoritarian governments? Why or why not? Again, discussion question 2. Are terrorist tactics justified against authoritarian governments? Why or why not? Okay, so we also see that that authoritarian governments are also willing to work with democracies, and this in some ways allows them to continue their repressive tactics. As we talked about in our previous class, we looked at U.S. policy towards terrorists after 9/11. We talked about in the early 2000s, especially the U.S. government's willingness to use extraordinary rendition. This was essentially kidnapping individuals on foreign soil, especially in European countries, and flying them to countries with authoritarian governments. Egypt was an example of this. They would fly suspected terrorists to Egypt to be tortured. And so in some ways, authoritarian governments have interest in providing aid to these democracies. These democracies oftentimes are willing to pay them, provide them support to do this, and a lot of times these authoritarian governments have issues with these same particular groups that democracies do. So the Egyptian government had concerns about Al-Qaeda in the early 2000s. The US has concerns about Al-Qaeda. Egypt can aid the United States by using extreme interrogation tactics, torture to try to get information. Both parties benefit. So we can see in some ways democracies, unfortunately, at certain points can play a role in continuing the facilitation of these extreme tactics by authoritarian governments based on their relationship with these governments. Finally, want to look here at this idea of comparing how the successes of democracies versus authoritarian governments combating terrorism. So we want to think about which type of government best combats terrorism. And I think this graph is an interesting way to look at it. So what we can see here, this graph doesn't just draw a strict dichotomy between authoritarian and democratic governments. It's more of a progressive scale. So we start here on the left with the most democratic types of countries, what we call liberal democracies. As we move to the middle, they become less democratic, more authoritarian, all the way to the far right where we get to these closed autocracies. These are the most authoritarian governments. So what do we see here? Interestingly, we see, based on the total number of terrorist attacks in 2002, that there were, if we combine even just the two most democratic types of governments, there were fewer attacks in the most democratic types of governments in 2002 than in the most authoritarian types of governments. But we still do see, interestingly, that these closed authoritarian governments, the most extreme, had fewer terrorist attacks than any other type of government. But by 2016, interestingly enough, what we see, there's been an increase in terrorist attacks around the world, regardless of the type of political regimes, the types of governments. But we do see there has been a greater increase in these more authoritarian style governments in the number of terrorist attacks they've had than in democratic governments. We still see substantially fewer attacks in democratic governments than we do in these authoritarian governments. So, for your final discussion question to wrap up the lecture today, I want to think about this idea. And so discussion question 2 is, why do you think there are fewer terrorist attacks in democracies compared to autocracies today? Again, discussion question 2. Why do you think there are fewer terrorist attacks in democracies compared to autocracies today? All right, thanks everybody for listening. Talk to you soon.